I agree with each of the concerns that you mentioned. I have three other concerns as well that I'm on the watch out for. I mean, one, so the first time he was elected, there was significant pushback from multiple sectors of society, and some of those same sectors of society seem much more acquiescent the second time around. I mean, an example might be large tech companies or the leaders giving donations to Donald Trump's campaign, or at least seemingly as a way to keep on his good side. And then we should talk about the courts. That's a whole other one. And the current Republican led Senate and House. Because, like, the Republican Party was not quite even not, there was much more dissent within the Republican Party at the beginning of Trump's first term than there is now. I'm going to give an analogy with corporations. There can be a lot of publicly traded companies where the corporation will focus on short-term benefit, trying to keep the stock prices up for that quarter for their corporation. There can be some value into that, but doing that too much, so you tend to do things that help you in the immediate term that aren't necessarily what's beneficial for the corporation in the 2, 5, or 10-year time frame in the long term. And I actually wonder if some of this short term, oh, we're going to make things seem better, we're going to make it look like I'm doing something, if in the long term that will actually prove very harmful to US society in a similar way. I also wonder, you referenced this at the beginning, but if this is the new way that presidencies happen, or if future presidents take aspects of this toolbox for this day and era, for this social media era, or whatever, however you want to call it, what are the implications of that? And what are the implications of that for how the government's run? Future presidents, they might not have the same charisma Donald Trump has, but they might use a similar toolkit with a much more systematic strategy. So like what you said at the beginning of our conversation, where Trump isn't known for systematic strategy. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so lots to cover there. I'll sort of break it down a little bit. So the dissent in terms of part of the party, my logic and reason of why we're seeing is that Trump won. If Trump had lost in 2024, I think the dissent would have continued and they would have tried to push away from Trumpism even further. But Trump won. And not only that, but the Republicans won the House and the Senate. So for a majority of the party, I think they've really have taken the stance that, with the exception of individuals, I can't believe I'm saying this, Mitch McConnell, who are on their way out and they're retiring and they can freely speak their minds, there's no point to criticize him because he got results, and you can criticize him and you can criticize him if you want, but then you're probably going to be out of a job. And so it's easier just to wait it out. If you're a young politician, 4 years Trump will be gone, and you're looking at this as more of an investment. That's how I would look at it if I was them. So it's easier to just keep my mouth shut and agree and just move on. I think there's still a little bit of resistance, especially we saw with some individuals who voted against the budget, where, they're still taking the approach that it's going to harm their constituents, and yes, it will. The new budget will harm a majority of predominantly southern states who have much lower income, but that's, I think, the explanation of why you're not seeing dissent within the party. Within the public, this is where my pessimism comes out. I think, for me personally, the reason I would putting myself in those would be that, what's the point? That's sort of the answer I come up with when I think about this is, what's the point? Yeah, I can go and march on the street. Yes, I can go and do this. But we did this 4 years ago, and what happens? Nothing changed. I think there's also fear on some accounts of, we're starting to see what equates to the results of almost a police state with crackdown of protests. And I also think that there's no one to really rally behind. If we think about it in terms of long-term perspective, people have been protesting the same thing for nearly 10 years now. Started with the first 4 years of Trump, and then throughout we kind of took a 4-year break, and now we're back doing the exact same thing, and people get burned out. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we saw results. So those are where I'm at in terms of that lack of dissent. Because you're right, we don't see the same fight. You're right. There's no marching on the streets. I've spoken with some people who were active in protests in the first Trump presidency, and a lot of them gave me that answer of just, yeah, what's the point? I'm tired of fighting, and there just doesn't seem to be any point to it. In terms of the long term, yeah, it's not going to help in the long term. But I don't think that matters to most people, because a lot of people, I think, we're now really seeing a shift of we want to see in the short term. We want to see that first quarter investment, because we want results now. We're not in this for long term. And I think we see this a lot of times with our society. Take environmental policies, yes, I could recycle, yes, I could do this, but this is more convenient and I need this right now. Yeah, Amazon is absolutely horrible for the environment, but I need to get this package in the next 24 hours. So yeah, I'm going to use Amazon. It's fine. It's kind of that give and take. And Robert Wright, who wrote the book The Common Good, spoke about this phenomenon of these barriers that, and I think I've spoken about this before, where we have these barriers in place, or fence posts, if you will. Once that fence post moves, it doesn't get moved back. Now we've just moved up, and then we get moved again. Now we have a new starting point. At no point does that fence post if we take the fence post to be the cultural norms that we have as society, they don't really go backwards. We don't say, oh, we're going to start doing this thing again that we stopped doing. So going forward, presidents probably won't be releasing their tax returns. That's a new norm we don't have to do anymore. So it's become, I think Trump has really dismantled those safeguards, those fence posts that we had, which kept society in check. And I think long term, I do worry. I've had these conversations with some of my interlocutors when I was interviewing them about almost any major civilization that had a democratic form of government has at some point undergone either a collapse or some kind of major shift that has changed. Democracy is not proven itself to be a long-standing form of government. I don't think that we're at a point where we can safely say that in 10, 20, 30 years, we're going to be in a place that it's secure and optimistic. And so those are, I think, the implications of the future, is that the more that we push down these barriers, the easier it is for worse things to happen. And you mentioned someone else other than Trump. That's the really terrifying thing is, and I had this conversation with one of my talkers after the elections, and he told me that the thing that frightens him the most is not Trump. It's the person that comes after Trump. It's the person that is smart, is intelligent, is strategic, someone almost like J.D. Vance, who has that long-term tactical thinking mind, because that's the person that terrifies him. Because once these norms are dismantled, once it becomes okay to detain people on the street to check their citizenship, once it becomes okay to just deport people, to hold people in custody, to arrest people based on protesting, to revoke student visas based on protesting, then it becomes really easy to start arresting people based on just protesting. Then it becomes really easy to say, your citizenship is a threat to this country. We're going to revoke your citizenship. Then it becomes really easy to do that. And do I think Trump is going to do that? I don't. I don't think he is. We'll see, but I don't think he is. Now, would someone else who has much more ill intent to do that? Yeah. And now Trump has made it easier. Trump has essentially said that here's the keys to the gates. Go ahead and do whatever you want. So that is what scares me as well. Someone who's really smart and has really ill intent comes forward and wins. That's what scares me.
I'm a little curious as to what you think the long-term implications would be for the United States. I mean, on the one end, this could be a sign of basic collapse, whether it's the start or the collapse is well underway of the US system. And if so, some systems collapse suddenly, like say sometimes the fall of Rome is depicted that way. I don't think that's actually fully a good historically accurate depiction, but that is often how it's depicted. And then you have places that wither. So the other Roman Empire, so the Eastern Roman Empire might be an example of that. The Byzantines, they peaked for a very long time and they actually continued to exist for several centuries before they officially collapsed. So if we're in the beginning of or somewhere on the way to collapse, how do you think that would play out for the United States? Or do you think democracy is not likely to fall apart in the United States because of the way that it's been the law of the land for 200 years, and so maybe on the other end there could be arguments, though there's going to be a pushback in the other direction, there's going to be a counter swing and things will be able to keep going. What are your thoughts?
My optimistic side agrees that we will not see the full collapse of democracy. And that's the one I do more firmly believe, not just trying to be optimistic. Do I think what we think of as democracy might change a little? Yes. Do I think from an economic standpoint, we are going to see or have already seen the collapse of the United States? I'm not an economist, I can't predict if we're going into recession, but in terms of if we're going to talk about when we think of the height of the American dream and the American as a superpower of the world, that's gone. That has been gone for years. If you ask me, I think that probably peaked during the Eisenhower administration. And then I think ever since Reagan and after, we've been going down. And I think one of the reasons we've seen Trump, someone like Trump, is we hit that rock bottom. Or we hit that point, maybe not rock bottom, but we hit that breaking point. I think actually a better analogy would almost be a seesaw, where we were up here and then we started to go down, down, down. We leveled off and then we just tipped underneath. So we just have tipped down. And now we've noticed that we're no longer in the air. Now we've noticed that, we're starting to touch the ground a little bit. Or if you want to reverse that, now we notice that our feet have left the ground. We didn't notice that until right now, but now we've noticed that that's different. And that's, I think, what people responded to is we have recognized that, things that you mentioned about these sort of policies and that they were non-long run. I think, we've been looking at that first quarter and trying to maximize that first quarter for a very long time. And we've just been kicking down the road this problem of massive debts, the fact that we don't have a sustainable spending policy, a sustainable health policy, that we do not have a policy that actually allows us to continue things. It's like the New York City subway station system, it's been falling apart for years and they just haven't invested the money to fix it. And it's just gotten worse. Someone who grew up in New York City, I can tell you, it's the same thing. I think that's where we're at I think we are witnessing the decline, or we have already hit that decline. Whether it's going to be a full, collapse, if we're expanding this to talk about other things, I think that is going to happen, but I don't think it's going to be isolated to the United States, and I think it's going to be due to other things like climate change, lack of resources, lack of fresh water, inclement weather, and I think that's going to be much more global. But I think, I do think that things are not optimistic in terms of the idea of that meritocracy, the American dream, that is gone, that has come and went. And I think you ask someone who's in college right now, is younger, they will tell you that. You ask someone who's much older, and I don't think they will. And that's where I think that disconnect is.
Yeah, there's a strong disconnect. I do think a lot of people see some of the bigger problems that are happening.
I would almost equate it to lived experience at this point. The person who bought their house when the market was, you could buy a house for what you could buy a car for now, is not going to think that it's impossible to buy a house. The 20-year-old that is working 4 jobs and tries to find a place to live and tries to find a house or rent or buy groceries is going to see that. And for them, I think they are sort of coming to the realization of this idea of I can go and I can get a job by working hard, and by getting that job I'll be able to have this amazing life. That's where I think the big the big separation is, not just academic, but also the lived experience. And that is why I also think that when we start to see the shifts in positions on Trump as well. There was an article in the New York Times the other day about a small, rural, very red, all-Trump town. Everyone in the town voted Trump. And then ICE came in and arrested and is now deporting one of the most beloved members of their community, this nice woman that owns a little shop. And everyone struck back and was saying, well, yeah, we wanted him to deport illegal immigrants. We didn't want him to deport illegal immigrants like her. And so it became this, well, now it affects me and now I care.
Mm-hmm.
Then people started to actually to think about, see the consequences of, oh, it's not just criminals, it's a mother and her kid that has just been scooped up. And now people are saying, oh, I don't like this.
Yeah, this makes total sense. And what I see as two factors for this is, one is the rate of the problems is increasing or is now significantly increasing. So the rate at which it's increasing is now increasing. So the degree to which it's getting worse is getting worse. I mean, this kind of goes back to that, how you were talking about how there was this shift. You were describing, the fancy word for what you were describing was an inflection point in like math and in calculus speak. I'm not going to define that because that's another podcast. That's not a good podcast. You need like a chalkboard for that one. But yeah, that the rate at which it's getting worse has significantly getting worse now. And that's affecting people in their day-to-day lives. It also, to me, it seems like it's a bit of a push between we'll say the rhetoric and messaging of Trump with the reality of actual policies. Kind of like what you said at the beginning of our conversation, Trump is very good at selling people and getting people hooked into relating to people and then selling people and then having a very vague, oh, I'll just make it better. But he was not very effective in actually getting stuff done. So the more Trump gets stuff done, the actual things he proposes would almost certainly make everything worse. So now that I'm going to get more stuff done, that's actually harming people. But before, those two things didn't actually have to brush up. People's vision of this is what I think versus what it would actually look like to do the things he's saying doesn't have to hit the hay if he's not effective at it.
And I think part of this, Trump learned from his first presidency. He saw, exactly that, his first presidency. Now, he did have a significant amount of executive orders, but it wasn't as much as this. It wasn't as quick as this, and he is doing more. And again, I will harken back to this every time. I think part of that is Trump doesn't have anything to lose. I think before it was, I'm kind of surprised I won. All right, now I have to actually figure out what I'm doing, and kind of just, now Trump is in office, he's already done it. And if I'm going to read into the psychology of Trump doesn't care if the Republican Party wins in the next election, with the caveat that if they win, then it makes him look better. Or if they lose, well, that was just a weak candidate and the Republican Party didn't listen to me. So Trump has an out either way. So I think what Trump is doing is harming people, and it's going to be, I think it's going to be a lot worse by the time he leaves office. And in an ironic sense, the people who are going to be hurt the most are the people who voted for Trump.
Yeah.
The majority of people who voted for Trump are going to be the ones that are going to be hit the most by these budget cuts, by cuts in programs, services, education, in Medicare. Like, that's who is going to get hurt. The college-educated individual that has a good job or a job, they may get hurt, but they're not going to be hurt in the same way. Everyone's going to be impacted by this, but I do think that the predominantly rural areas, which predominantly vote for Republican and vote Trump, will be hurt. It's not going to be good.
Yeah, Trump at the end of the day, to call a spade, he's a bit of a scam artist. He looks out for himself, and
Yes,
I agree with you. He doesn't fundamentally care about Republicans. He
Trump is one of the best scam artists that I have seen.
he correctly spoke to people that are having problems, particularly
Yes,
in rural communities and in multiple other parts of the United States. Snake oil salesmen sell to people who are sick. And unfortunately, that means he's probably going to lead them off worse. It's one of the, I think, the sad aspects of this. One thing we're talking about short-term gain. I think one institution in the United States that's supposed to be really cued towards the long term is the courts. You mentioned this briefly at the beginning of the conversation, but what do you think about some of the court responses to Donald Trump?
I can't speak to a lot of them, but I will say I am shocked by Amy Coney Barrett's response to some of them. We're talking about the Supreme Court. At the lower levels, I think that there is among some courts a desire to uphold laws and standards, but Trump doesn't abide by laws and standards. I think that that's something that society now needs to reckon with is what happens if the president doesn't abide by a court's ruling. Because we've never had to deal with that. But what we're seeing now is the courts have made rulings, they filed this, and Trump doesn't do anything. So what can you do? Do you arrest the president of the United States? Well, the Supreme Court ruling has said that anything that he does during his presidency, he's immune for. So it kind of just has created this situation where Trump doesn't need to do anything. Trump doesn't want to do.
Yeah, this is a tension. I agree with you. It seems to be mostly created by the Supreme Court. A lot of the lower courts actually push back a lot on the
Yeah,
breaches to the Constitution that Trump has been trying
yeah.
to do. On some level, to me, it seems like they back themselves into a little bit of a corner. And that big decision, the presidents are basically immune. And it seems like they might be slowly starting to push back. Like first they were much more enabling. I wonder if they're starting to see, okay, we need to start pushing back, and they'll maybe try to walk back that. That might be an overly optimistic stance on some of the key Supreme Court officials' positions currently, or the trajectories that that's moving in. It might also be too little too late, even if they tried. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I think that the courts pushing back are a good thing, and I think that it took some time for things to settle. But yes, I agree. A lot of lower courts are pushing back, and I think that's some of the key forms of resistance that we are seeing. But I also do think it is too little too late. Even if the Supreme Court ruled something, I'm not even sure that Trump would follow what the Supreme Court said at this point.
Right.
And I honestly don't know what that really means for the future of the United States and the presidency in that regard. I'm hopeful that in smaller court rulings, at least, that will prevent local officials and local actions from happening, and it will allow states to be able to push back. But I'm not 100% sure what that is going to really look like.
Yeah, this makes total sense. And then you also have the difference in time frame between the slow moving of the courts versus
Yeah.
Trump's blitzkrieg strategy. I agree. I think it might be too little, too late. Even if that's the direction that putting focus on the Supreme Court, if that's the direction that they go, maybe there's hope in some of these lower courts, like you said. My final question for you is, how do you think the Democrats should respond to this? If you were advising them, what would you say?
If I was advising the Democrats at this point, I would say, first off, you've got 3-ish years now. Get on the ground, go start knocking on doors and talking to people. Find out what people want. Because clearly your message right now is not resonating. Find out what you want and then build your party and your platform based on what you hear from people. And then actually deliver. If you are able to, the Democrats are able to win back the midterm, get results. show that what you are doing is actually happening. Republicans right now are not holding those town halls, they're not holding those town constituents because they're getting yelled at. You should be the ones going and do that, and focus on acknowledging what people hear. Don't try to say, well, this was better. Say, yeah, things do suck. How can I fix it? That's what I would do if I were them. In terms of the broader strategy, if you get into office, or if you have that, find someone who resonates with voters. And now that we've had some time to reflect, I think the biggest issue that may have changed the last election was if they had an open primary. There is not anyone leading the party right now that voters really resonate with. But I think that the Democrats need to take a good hard look and figure out what their message is. I think they need to take a stance, and I think they try to balance this act between being too moderate and being too far left. The Republican Party has fully embraced being as far right as it wants, and just accepted that, you know what, people will either vote for us or they won't, but I think they'll vote for us because they like us. They still like some of our platforms more. I think the Democratic Party needs to find an issue that people really care about, embrace something, and stick to it. None of this flip-flopping. And then my final piece of advice of what it would be is play by the Republicans' rules. Democrats, Republicans, both of them do sketchy things in Congress, but the obstructionism of someone like Mitch McConnell really, really, really hurt the Obama presidency. It really hurt the Democrats' ability to say, as you said, you think of Obama, it's this one bill. But Obama had a whole bunch of other things that he couldn't do because of the Republicans filibustering, because that nothing got done. Clog up I would say, do the same thing here. I understand when Chuck Schumer decided not to shut down the government because he believed that it would just play into the narrative that they don't need the government, and then they would just make cuts anyway. But from a political standpoint, if I had been him, I would have had it shut down for a week or so, because that's the only type of negotiations that, or language that Trump understands, is you either win or you lose. There's no compromise. And, I know Schumer was in a very difficult, almost impossible situation there, but that's what I would say is, first off, figure out from people what they want, find a way to give it to them, and play by the same playbook that the Republican Party is, because you're trying to play nice and the other team is not playing nice. It's unfortunate that that's where we've come to, but I think that's the results.
Yeah, this makes total sense. One frustration I have on the Democratic side is there's a lot of frustration with Donald Trump. There's numbers of people that are frustrated with some of the key policies coming out. I'm thinking particularly economy, immigration, some of the others, but those two in particular. But I don't necessarily see the Democratic Party doing a good job of collecting that frustration and galvanizing it to let's do something about this. So it ends up being frustration towards Trump, not necessarily let's rally to do something different. And like what you said, that would involve getting with the people that are frustrated, understanding why they're frustrated, what their goals are, and how this is seeming to hurt their prospects, their lives, what they want to do, and then rallying behind that. And they're not really starting with what do these various people want. They're often starting from the opposite perspective, more of a big picture ideology, and then trying to get people on board to that. Yeah, there seems to be a new rules to the game. This is something you said before, and they haven't really got onto those rules yet. Any parting thoughts? I mean, I think this conversation was a bit more pessimistic than some of our others.
Yeah, I wish I had any better parting thoughts to end us on a higher note. I suspect we'll probably be talking again in the future, and hopefully I definitely will be keen to see what the midterm elections look like. I'm optimistic that we'll see a swing during the midterms, but I honestly don't know. If they do see a swing, I think things are going to still be really bad unless things radically improve. Hopefully next time we talk, it's a little more positive.
Yeah, I'm also optimistic for a swing in the midterms, and sometimes big problems require big solutions. So sometimes you can't end on, and then if we do this, then everything will be okay. Because you need to sit in the problem for a longer period of time. And I think some
Yeah.
of the problems we talked about they've been accelerated with Donald Trump, but they're decades in the running. So they need a bit more time to sit in and to find a solution rather than just jumping the gun and saying, oh,
Yeah.
this will work. That's how you get to a fake solution. Thanks for
Exactly.
taking the time now, and I wish you the best until next time we talk.
All right. Sounds good.